Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hocton. I'm a public historian, author and broadcaster. Today I'm going to be talking about the Scottish Wars of Independence, Robert the Bruce, Sir William Wallace and the Black Douglas, all those amazing characters. I absolutely love this period in Scotland's history because it's what formed Scotland into the nation that we are today. And this is a subject that when I first became interested in history, I really sort of immersed myself in it. I went as far back and as deep as I possibly could. So that's where I would like to start. It's an exciting ride, and I'm sure that some of you may be familiar with the movie Braveheart. Well, that's all part of the Scottish Wars of Independence. It's where that began at that particular time. So I'm going to start with Alexander II, someone whom most of you will probably never have heard of, who was one of the last of the Canmore descendants. Canmore in Gaelic means big or head and refers to a dynasty effectively established, I guess, by Malcolm III of Scotland, you know, the man who actually killed Macbeth and then killed Macbeth's son, Lulach, who took the throne in 1058. And the Canmore dynasty, just in case you do any further research on this, and you come across the name Dunkeld, the Canmore dynasty was also known as the House of Dunkeld. So Alexander II was 16 years old when he was crowned at Scone Palace on the 5th of December, 1214. His father was William I, or William the Lion, who had died the day before. He died on the 4th of December, and of course there was no time whatsoever for mourning because a coronation was about to take place, and Alexander II was crowned on Moot Hill, or the Hill of Belief, as it's known near Scone Palace. He was crowned on the Stone of Destiny, or the Stone of Scone, which was the coronation stone, if you will, of Scotland. The throne just being a big block of stone. But this was no ordinary stone. It was brought to Scotland from Ireland, and there is no doubt that everyone believed and believes that it has magical properties, and I'll talk more about that later. Alexander's sole aim was to control all of Scotland and rid his new kingdom of English overlordship once and for all. England and King John I really considered Scotland just to be part of northern England. Scotland wasn't its own nation at this particular point, and Alexander II wanted Scotland to be an independent nation, but they had to have essentially permission from the Pope to be so. And he regularly asked the Pope for holy oils that were then to be placed on the king's crown that would essentially mean that he was recognized by the Pope as King of Scotland. But the Pope refused. So while England has this kind of overlordship, if you will, of Scotland, the Western Isles in the Northern Isles were mainly controlled by those with Viking descent. So Norwegians, if you like. As I mentioned, John I was King of England at this time, and Alexander, along with many of the English barons, were rather annoyed over John's demands that they should finance, John's wars over in France. The barons and Alexander presented a new charter to John, known now as the Magna Carta, where Alexander was promised the disputed northern territories of England. These territories were Northumberland, Cumberland, Westmoreland, and today they are under English rule. But throughout history, these lands have actually been claimed by the Scots and have been part of Scotland. How maps change. King John largely ignored the terms of the Magna Carta pretty much as soon as it was signed, and very soon Scotland descended into civil war, which led Alexander II of the Scots in October 1215 to invade England. And he laid siege to Norham Castle, which is just over the border in Northumberland on the other side of the River Tweed. He also ordered Newcastle to be destroyed, as well as Carlisle. In 1237, Alexander signed the Treaty of York, and this was the first time that a proper border had actually existed between these two countries. Even if you go back to Roman times, with Hadrian's Wall, that was never a border. It was really just a wall, a delineation line, if you like, for the Romans to keep the Scots and the Gaels out. So this was the first time a border had ever actually been decided and been formed. And it's largely unchanged even to this day. So basically, the River Tweed is the borderline. Anything north of the River Tweed is Scotland. Anything below is England. And it was at this time that Scotland became known as the land of the Scots. So now Scotland was considered to be its own independent nation because there was effectively a border that delineated between England and Scotland. Alexander then turned his attention to the Viking Norwegian-held Western Isles that were controlled by the Norwegians. The king of Norway at the time was Håkon IV, and Alexander was in Oban in July of 1249, ready to do battle, but he died on the 8th of July, 1249, on the Isle of Carrera, which can be seen on a nice day from Oban. He died there as Håkon was making his way from Norway, and no battle ensued. We can then turn our attention to Alexander II's son, who became the new king. This was Alexander III. They were obviously highly original with their names back in these days. And the other thing we're about to do is we're about to meet quite a few Margarets along the way as well. So I'll try and delineate between them, but I hope you can keep up. So Alexander III was 7 years old when he was crowned. Again, at the same place as his father, at Skun Palace, on top of the Stone of Destiny. He was married 3 years later, at aged 10, to Margaret, who was the daughter of England's King Henry III, who herself was 11 years of age. Many thought that this would actually form a union between the two countries, but realistically, it was never going to happen. So at age 18, he set out to achieve what his father had failed to achieve, and that was to regain the Western Isles from King Håkon IV. First of all, he sent envoys across to Norway, and Håkon sent their heads back in a basket. Then Alexander attacked the Isle of Skye, and of course Håkon came running with his invasion fleet just off the west coast of Scotland near a place called Largs. The battle itself took place in early October, but in late September 1263, the invasion fleet heading down from Norway was largely damaged by storms. And by the time that they actually landed, the Norwegian army had no fight left in them whatsoever. Luck was on his side. So when the fight, or the Battle of Largs, took place on the 2nd of October, it was really just a series of skirmishes, and the Norwegians really weren't into it. It was nothing like, your full-scale battles that were to take place in the future, like Stirling Bridge or Bannockburn, etc. It was nothing like that. And Håkon actually retreated back towards Norway, but as he did, he fell very ill. And they had to land him on a boat on the mainland of Orkney in Kirkwall, and Håkon actually then died in Bishop's Palace, the ruins of which are still there today, and definitely worthwhile a visit. With Håkon now dead, negotiations then began with Alexander and what was left of Håkon's government, the Norwegians, about the sale of the isles. And the sale of these western islands was agreed as long as Scotland kept their hands essentially off the islands of Orkney and a little bit further south, Shetland. Back in England, Henry III dies and Edward becomes King of England. In 1266, Prince Edward was actually on his way back from a crusade and the defense of Acre. But now we have Edward I, who's a prominent king who became known as Longshanks, for he had incredibly long legs and a relatively short body. In Scotland, however, in time, he would become known as the Hammer of the Scots. As Alexander got older, his luck started to turn for the worst. In 1274, his wife Margaret died, but they had 3 children together, 2 sons, David and Alexander, and 1 daughter whom they named, no surprise, Margaret. Margaret then married the new king of Norway, Eric, enlarged to repair the relationship with the Norwegians that was scarred by the death of Haakon IV. Alexander's son David then falls ill and dies just before Margaret's wedding. We don't know what of, but it could have been 1,000 things in those days. Smallpox was highly contagious and, often fatal. Tuberculosis was a common disease at that time. Leprosy was actually less common, but still present. And of course, it could have also been typhoid fever or dysentery or, many, many other things. On the 9th of April, 1283, Margaret also dies during complications with childbirth. However, the infant did survive, but she was very weak and sickly, whom they also called Margaret. And she actually came, just to delineate this Margaret, she actually became known as Margaret, the Maid of Norway. The last surviving child, Alexander, Prince of Scots, he died as well, just after getting married. So King Alexander is left with a wee bit of a problem. He now has no male heirs. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, well, I guess she's the last, so potentially the heir, and was to be queen. But this is not what the people of Scotland wanted. They don't want a weak queen, and they don't want a weak Norwegian queen. They're looking for a warrior king. They want a strong king. And this is where Scotland's history starts to get a bit complicated. So Alexander is forced to remarry, and he does. He marries a young French princess by the name of Yolande de Dreux. This new bride is approximately 22 years old, and at this stage, Alexander is in his late 40s, maybe even early 50s. And as you can imagine, he's quite up for making babies with someone almost half his age. So he's quite keen on the task, I would say. But of course, then we have the event that happens on the 18th of March, 1286. And these are the events that really are the catalyst to the beginning of the wars, to the beginning of the Scottish Wars of Independence. Alexander was holding a council in Edinburgh Castle on this night, on the 18th of March, 1286. And he decides after the council finishes that he wants to go and see his bride. So after a few drinks and a big meal, he decides to leave Edinburgh Castle, which was his main royal residence at the time. And he decides to leave there at about 8 o'clock at night to head to a place called Fife in the Kingdom of Fife, where his wife resides. To do so, he has to cross quite a dangerous and treacherous stretch of water known as the Firth of Forth. So Alexander leaves Edinburgh Castle that night, and it's blowing a hoolie outside. And a hoolie in Scotland is a fierce, mad storm. And there was a major hoolie going on that night. So why you wouldn't postpone it to the following day, I do not know. Anyway, he arrives at Queen's Ferry, and the ferryman, who's shocked to see the king with 2 aides-de-camp with him, agrees to take him across. Alexander proclaims, really to calm everyone down, that everything's going to be fine and that they have God on their side. And they do. They make it across this turbulent Firth of Forth, which is rough on a good day. And very eager to go and see his young wife, Alexander then jumps on his horse and rides away, leaving his aides trailing behind him. Alexander was never seen alive again. He was found the following morning on the 19th of March at the bottom of what we now refer to as King's Crag. He had a broken neck. Had he fallen? Was he murdered? We will never know. But what we do know is that the King of the Scots is now dead. The fate of Scotland's hands now rest in the young hands of 3-year-old Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Scotland was about to get what they didn't want, and that was a queen. So after the death of Alexander III, a parliament of nobles and churchmen were called, and allegiance was sworn by them to Margaret, and they vowed to keep Scotland safe until she could arrive from Norway to take the throne for herself. Remember, she's only 3 years old. But can you imagine the scheming that now begins to take place and the deals that were being struck behind closed doors? Think Macbeth and dark rooms and drinking places, men in cloaks and hats drawn down, whispering about the future monarch. Edward I of England was invited to assist in the safekeeping of Scotland, but only under the proviso that Margaret, Maid of Norway, would marry Prince Edward of England. Therefore, their children would be the first shared monarchs of both Scotland and of England. It had never happened before. But if the marriage did take place, Prince Edward would, by law, become the true king of Scotland, because in those times, in medieval times, actually all the way through to pretty much the 19th century, women, much like land, were the property of the men. So it's agreed in principle, and things then start to calm down because it's a chess game after all, and people are maneuvering around the board. And of course, this takes time. So things remain peaceful for the following 3 years. When Margaret is 6 years old, she leaves Oslo in Norway in October 1290 to head to Edinburgh. She was supposed to land at the docks in Leith, but on the way she also fell very ill, just like her grandfather, Haakon IV, and was taken to mainland Orkney, where she too died in the bishop's palace in Kirkwall. The rumour says that it was due to severe seasickness, but this is a game of chess, and we know that Scotland didn't want a queen. So did she die of seasickness or was she murdered? We'll never know. But what we do know now is that the Canmore line that could be traced all the way back to Kenneth MacAlpine, the first ever King of Scots, was now finished. It had ended with the death of Margaret, and a new king must now be chosen. And with that, let's have a wee break and a message from our sponsor. Altidomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Altidomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia, and that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Altidomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So the death of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, Alexander's granddaughter, has left Scotland in a position where all of its royal monarchy and the royal line has now ended. There is no more Canmore line. So the search for a new king begins. Two men come forth to state their claim to the Scottish throne. One is a man called John Balliol, and the other is Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce is a name which is synonymous with Scotland, of course, but this isn't Robert the Bruce. They are, however, related. This is Robert the Bruce's grandfather. So the Scottish nobility and the Scottish churchmen, they were going to choose who is the next king of the Scots. They'd already had this decided. However, they then realized that they can't do this on their own. And the Pope says that they have to have an intermediary and a middleman, if you like. And this middleman was chosen by the Pope as Edward I of England, the Longshanks. So Edward I is going to help Scotland choose a new king. So he invites the Scottish nobility down to England, to Norman Castle, just over the border between Scotland and England, just on the other side of the River Tweed. And the Scottish nobility refused to cross the border because they argue that all of Scotland's matters, Scotland being an independent country, as they were at the time, all the decisions about Scotland should be made in Scotland. That's fair enough. However, Edward was having none of it. Edward wants this to be sorted out on his own land. And he also then said that if the Scottish nobility wanted him to help them, and of course they had no choice, they would have to declare his overlordship over Scotland. So effectively, Edward would be Scotland's overlord. And essentially, if they didn't do this, Edward would then bring great wrath into Scotland. So he's effectively saying, sure, you can have a king, you can name your own king, I'll help you do it, but that king will report to me. The first man to finally agree to cross the border into England and pledge his allegiance to King Edward was Robert Bruce. This is a political move. The Bruces are playing for lands in England, and they're hoping to placate Edward in the process. The last of the men to do this was John Balliol. Edward had placed another stipulation on all of this. Again, it was Robert Bruce and John Balliol who had put their hands up to become king, but just to muddy the waters, Edward had actually gone out and found 11 other claimants to the Scottish throne. The game was afoot, basically just to make it even harder for the Scots. And Edward didn't want it just to be a direct choice between these two men. Edward was going to make it as convoluted and as long a process as possible by introducing these other 11 men. This is what we now refer to as the Great Cause. There were 13 men in total. And of course, eventually it was always going to get whittled down to 2, Bruce and Balliol. And ultimately, it was John Balliol that was chosen to become Scotland's new king. And this was not what Scotland's nobles wanted. This was what Edward wanted. Robert Bruce was actually the noble that the Scots wanted. He was a warrior king, but that was the last thing that Edward wanted. John Balliol was nothing more than a puppet to Edward, and he was incredibly materialistic. He wanted all the accoutrement that went with becoming king. He wanted the jewels, he wanted the crown, he wanted the kudos for becoming king. But he was a puppet to Edward. He, of course, was crowned at Scone Palace on the Stone of Destiny, and he swears allegiance to Edward I. Immediately, the people of Scotland turn on him, and they call him Tum Tabard, the empty jacket, which is an incredibly derogatory term, and they shout it at him wherever he goes. And it's for this reason, now there's a few other reasons as well that I'll go into a little bit later, but this is the main reason why John Balliol to this day is regarded as the worst king that Scotland ever had. So much to the point that if your name is John and you want to ascend to the Scottish throne, the Scots insist that you change your name. It's seen as an unlucky name in royalty terms. And if you don't believe me, go and have a look at the name of King Robert III of the Scots, and you'll find that his name was actually John. If your name's John, they'll always make you change it. So John Balliol, or Tum Tabard, really started getting on the nerves of Edward I, who was an impatient man anyway, because while you've got a puppet king there, the longer that the puppet king is in control, the more power that he eventually wants. And John Balliol wanted eventually to become a real king. I think if truth be told, he actually did grow a bit of a backbone, and he actually started doing what his people wanted him to do, supporting the people against the English. Edward, on the other hand, wanted to go to war with France, and he wanted to take John Balliol, the Scottish king, and the Scottish troops with him. And of course, John Balliol, along with his barons, refused to go because he was actually friends with the French king. They liked each other. This turned out to be a big mistake because Balliol then ended up angering and annoying Edward I. Balliol physically went to France, unbeknownst to Edward I, and signed an alliance with the French king. And this is known as the Old Alliance, spelled A-U-L-D, which is the old Scots word for old. So it's an old alliance, and essentially it's that kind of classic kind of playground sort of thing where, you say to the big bully, if you hit my friend, I'm going to hit you back. So what they're basically saying is that if France is attacked by England, Scotland will help out. And if Scotland is attacked by England, France will help out. The Old Alliance, however, didn't work from the outset. And this was basically because England's army was massive. England's army outnumbered the Scots army ridiculously so. But also, the French weren't really that up much for fighting either. So when Edward eventually did invade France and Scotland retaliated, Edward was simply able to just take half of his troops from France and send them up into Scotland. And the problem was essentially eradicated. But of course, with John Balliol and the Scots attacking England, This annoyed Edward even further. So Edward actually followed his invasion troops into Scotland himself. His first port of call was the town of Berwick upon Tweed, as it is now known. So, of course, with the word Tweed in there, you know that it's near the Scottish border. And, of course, Berwick upon Tweed nowadays is in England, but at this stage it was actually just in Scotland. But it was one of those times where it constantly changed between, English occupation and Scottish occupation. But at this time, it's actually under Scottish occupation. So Edward actually invades Berwick, invades Scotland. And they decide to put it to siege. They sack it over the course of 3 days, and they massacre or slaughter over 90% of the population. Edward at one stage actually called for an end to the slaughter, and he called it after one incident which was recorded where he saw a soldier, an English soldier, killing a pregnant woman who was actually in the process of giving birth at the time. But his troops, to be honest, were too far gone to pay any attention. And the other thing was, why should they? Because you have to keep in mind that troops back in these days, although they were paid a salary, they were also guaranteed spoils of war. And after the killing, they would strip you of everything valuable. So Berwick is actually a very important town specifically for trade, because they were trading very aggressively at this stage with the Netherlands and also into Germany. It's a port town and still is effectively to this day. And by invading and sacking Berwick, you're effectively cutting Scotland off from the rest of Europe. But Edward doesn't stop at Berwick. They're headed further north and right up into the northeast of Scotland to a place called Montrose. And that's where they find John Balliol. He is subsequently arrested and stripped of his land. He's stripped of his titles. And of course, he's stripped of the crown of the Scots. John Balliol is no longer to be regarded as King of the Scots, and he's placed in prison in the Tower of London for pretty much the rest of his life, which wasn't very long. I think he was in the Tower for a total of 8 years, and I think he lived for another 3. And he spent his last remaining years in France. So Edward effectively captures Balliol, he occupies Scotland, he takes over all the major towns and city, and he places garrisons there. But he has one last stop before heading back to England, and that last stop is Scone Palace, where the kings and queens of Scotland were crowned. And this is where Scotland's Stone of Destiny was to be found. Edward steals the Stone of Destiny from the palace at Scone and takes it down to England. And the significance of this is that it's Scotland's coronation stone. It means that even if there's another king of Scotland to be found, they can't be crowned. And Edward takes it down to England and specifically places it under the coronation throne of England. It's a direct indication that Scotland's throne is now regarded as inferior to the English throne, and that England now rules over Scotland. So the Stone of Destiny was stolen in the year 1296. But as I said, there's a little bit more to this story, and the stone itself has actually its own amazing story. And at the end of this series, I'll tell you that story, one that spans over 700 years. So Balliol is in the Tower, the stone has been stolen, Scotland is a slave nation to the English, and Edward is now back in England. Scotland is thrown into absolute turmoil. 1 year later, Scotland starts to shiver and rise from the ashes, and the name William Wallace is heard for the first time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Look out for episode number 2 of the Scottish Wars of Independence. Bye for now.